and cordoning off the area where she was killed. And is this for Carrie Lightner? And they said, oh, yes. And I said, oh, that's my daughter. And they said, well, did the police call and tell you that they arrested the man who killed your daughter? And I said, yes, they did. And they said, did they tell you that he was driving drunk? Did they tell you that he has been convicted of drunk driving 3 times before? Did they tell you he was still driving on a valid California driver's license?
Greetings, friends, brothers and sisters from all over the world. Welcome to another edition of Without Notes. Today, our episode is really going to be a fascinating one. You're going to meet my partner for the expedition, a woman named Candace Lightner, who literally changed the world. Not many people can say that, but she can. She formed an organization many years ago called Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Today, you will witness her story in uncut, unvarnished fashion and learn the real story of Mothers Against Drunk Driving and how the death of her daughter led to a social movement that still resonates today, many decades later. Candy, welcome to Without Notes.
Oh, thank you. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you. Candy, let's start right at the beginning. Where were you born?
Pasadena, California, in a hotel that was converted to a hospital during the war.
Wow, okay. And so, born in Pasadena, California, raised in Pasadena?
Oh, no, I was a military brat. In fact, I tell people I was born in the military, raised in the military, married in the military, divorced in the military, and retired after 32 years of service. So I was fortunate enough to live all over the world. I lived in France, in Germany, in Japan, Okinawa, Guam. In fact, I sat on Bob Hope's lap, and not long ago, this is years ago in Guam, and not long ago, his sister was at an event for the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, and I was there too because, as you know, I know Elizabeth. I absolutely love her. She's just my hero. And went up and had my photo taken with his sister and told her that I sat on his lap when I was 3 years old, and that if I could find the photo, I said I still may have the photo. She asked me to send it to her. So.
Okay. And where did you go to college, Candy?
I didn't. I went
You did not.
No, I went to 2 years at Sacramento City, dragging my twin babies around with me. And that was as far as I got, actually. And I don't even think.
How old were you when you first became a mother?
Oh, I was 19, 20. I think I told you this, Michael. I used to live in a commune. I knew Janis Joplin, Big Brother in the holding company. This was in the hippie days. I lived on Muir Beach, slept on the floor, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
Okay, so now you become a dental assistant, and then take us through the next elements of the journey for you, Candy.
I worked as a dental assistant, also while I was going to school and trying to go to college, and raising 2 babies by myself.
And by the way, money is not plentiful. Is that fair?
No, I was actually on, I'm sorry, I forget what they call it now, but in those days we called it welfare. Right. So I was on welfare, which was incredibly limited. I think I was getting something like $108 a month. And in those days, I'm sure it was far different than it is now, but in those days, you could not take money from other people and still collect welfare. So I would babysit for people for food and, help or whatever. And that's what you had to do. So anyway,
I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. I want the audience to hear this. You would in addition to receiving welfare, you would babysit and you couldn't accept payment, so you would receive food.
Food, primarily food, or sitting services. We reciprocate,
Sure.
where they would also sit for my twins. And so I did this for a couple of years, and then I met my husband, who was an officer in the Air Force, and he proposed, and we got married, and then we were stationed in Mountain Home Air Force Base, Idaho, and where he received his training. And while there, I got pregnant with my son Travis, and I asked him to please try and get out of going to war, because I didn't want to have my son alone. I would have preferred to have someone with me. And so however they worked it, he traded with somebody else. He actually went later on, but I was able to then have him at the birth of my son. And then we were stationed in, I think that's right. He went to Vietnam after Okinawa. I came back to the States and lived in Sacramento, near my sister, whose husband was also an officer in the Air Force, and near my parents, who retired. And he went off to Vietnam.
But Candy, I want to establish, I know you know this and I know it, but I want the audience to know that this was a time in which there was a draft in America.
Mm-hmm.
And so today we live in a society in which there's an all-voluntary military. The draft, I believe, was ended in 1973. But at the time you're speaking, there was a draft. You didn't just say, I don't feel like going. Everyone went or served and were deployed or not. So there was a lottery, if you recall, for the draft.
Oh, I do.
People had lottery numbers and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a very different America than the one we're in today, in which in that America, everybody knew someone who was drafted, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And today, almost no one knows anyone in the American military, or very few.
Mm-hmm.
It's a voluntary force. So it's a very different America. So you had your son, and now your husband stays with you. How long does your marriage last, Candy?
I think it was 7 years.
7 years. Marriage lasts 7 years.
Most of which we spent apart, actually, because of his job and his flying and whatever. He was gone most of the time. In fact, when my son was run over, he was gone. He was on TV.
Well, that is the dramatic moment that we want to come to. And Candy, I'm going to ask you, if you would, with all your vulnerability and authenticity and transparency, to take it from here. Talk about what happens that then changes your life and then goes on to change the world.
Okay. When my son was run over, it was not when I started MAD. My son was run over by an unlicensed woman on tranquilizers, and he was in a coma. He's permanently brain injured. And at the time, I was so focused and on taking care of him that this wasn't like the drunk driving incident that happened later. But at the time, I was so focused on taking care of him because they didn't expect him to survive. And then he was in a coma, and then we had to deal with all kinds of things for years afterwards. When Carrie was killed, which was some years later, we were still living in the same home. And she was killed while walking to a Catholic school carnival, and she and her friend were inside the bicycle lane. They had crossed over to go to the carnival, and they were inside the bicycle lane. And a drunk driver who had been drinking at the bar right down the street, and had been arrested the night before and just released on bail and went straight to the bar, was going back home and hit her from behind through 125 feet. Left her in the road to die. I later learned that he actually blacked out for a few minutes and then kept on going. And of course, she was killed. Well, she was pronounced, actually, rather kind of an interesting, fascinating story, but she was, when everyone showed up, it was 1:20 in the afternoon. They thought she had died, but they were able to, the mailman who happened to live across the street from us actually was able to revive her. And as a result of that, the post office, and I don't know if it was just there, decided that all their post people should learn how to do CPR. And so they did as a result of what he was able to do. And then they took Carrie to the hospital and she was pronounced dead sometime later.
Carrie is 13 years old. What year is this?
1980.
Kendi, what I want to try to establish for the audience, which is going to be maybe hard due to the enormous success of your work. It's going to be very hard for the audience to recognize the world 1980, in which drunk driving was considered a joke.
It was socially acceptable. It was
socially acceptable.
The only socially acceptable crime in the country.
Right. So if one person said to another, I drove home drunk last night, the standard reaction in America at that moment would be laughter.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, hilarious. Oh, I did too. It was utterly and completely socially acceptable. There was no stigma whatever to that. Is that a fair remark?
There is absolutely no question about it. And I have several examples, but one, when I started MAD, I advertised in the Sacramento Bee, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the LA Times asking if anybody had been impacted by drunk driving to contact me because I was starting a movement. And the graphics in the newspapers were cute little guys weaving around the road with laughter signs around them. And that's what the graphics were at that time.
I cannot emphasize enough for this audience that there was no social stigma. It was considered funny. It was laughed about on television. Johnny Carson would have guests on. They would talk about it with laughter.
Any attempt to restrict drinking and driving here is viewed by some as downright undemocratic.
It's kind of getting common is when a fella can't put in a hard day's work, put in 11, 12 hours a day, and then get in your truck and at least drink 1 or 2 beers.
They're making it laws where you can't drink when you want to. You have to wear a seatbelt when you're driving. And pretty soon we're going to be a communist country.
And so, Candace Lightner decides after the death of Carrie to do what?
Well, what happened is, as you know, it was hit and run. So we didn't know who killed her. And we didn't know what the circumstances were. And as I said, he had injured someone the night before in a drunk driving crash. Although her injuries weren't serious, he had totaled his car. So when he was driving the day he killed my daughter, he was driving his wife's car. She had gone ahead and given him permission, even though she knew he was an alcoholic. He'd had multiple priors before, and it was a multiple repeat offender drunk driver. And she had given him permission to drive her car. And also, she was the one who called the highway patrol on him, actually, after she found out that a child was killed. But it was several days before we found out who it was. And at the time, we were getting the police called me and they said, we found the man who killed your daughter. And I said, oh no, I thought it was a kid. I honestly, God, thought it was some young kid. And those were the days when you had the cigarette lighters in your car. And my image was, that some kid was lighting a cigarette and bent over to get the cigarette lighter, put it up and hit my daughter and kept going. And the police didn't tell me any differently. I asked him how old he was, and they told me he was 44. I asked if he had any children. They said yes, that he had a son and a daughter around the same age as my daughter. I expressed my sympathy to the children and said, oh, please let them know how sorry I am this happened. And then we were all getting ready to go out to dinner. We left. we go out, and she was killed right near my home, and we're driving down Sunset where she was killed. And I saw the police doing yellow tape and cordoning off the area where she was killed. And I didn't quite understand it. So I pulled over. My friends pulled over. I wasn't driving. And I got out of the car and I went up and I said, is this for Carrie Lightner? And they said, oh, yes. And I said, oh, that's my daughter. And they said, well, did the police call and tell you that they arrested the man who killed your daughter? And I said, yes, they did. And they said, did they tell you that he was driving drunk? And I was afraid if I said no, they wouldn't tell me anymore. So I said, yes, they did. And they said, did they tell you that he has been convicted of drunk driving 3 times before? And I went, yes, they did. And they said, did they tell you he was still driving on a valid California driver's license? And I went, yes, they did. And they said, they were kind of shaking their head. And I said, well, how long will he spend in prison? And they said, for what? And I said, well, for drunk driving. How long will he spend in prison? And the guy laughed and he said, lady, you'll be lucky to see any jail time, much less prison. And that's what did it. So we went off to the restaurant, and while we were waiting for our table, I was sitting there, and my sister looked at me and she said, I know you well. You're not going to let this go. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm going to start a movement, an organization. And my girlfriend piped up and said, and you're going to call it Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, which we were drivers at first. And I went, we all kind of went, ooh. And I said, yes, I will. And that's how it started.
That began a change. Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Again, for the audience, I cannot emphasize how impactful over just a few years this movement was. Also, I want to re-emphasize to the audience what Candy has just announced. There was a man who was convicted multiple times, not once, not twice, not 3 times, multiple times.
No, he was convicted 3 times, and this
3
was
times.
his 5th arrest.
5th arrest, 5 arrests.
Mm-hmm.
No jail time, out, valid driver's license.
Mm-hmm.
This was socially acceptable in our then hard to recognize country. And at a dinner with her sister, she says, I'm done. I'm going to do this. Mothers Against Drunk Drivers was born. All right. And what year was that, Candy?
1980. I started May 7th. She was killed May 3rd, and I started May 7th.
May 7th. Now, had you had any experience in starting a social movement?
No, I volunteered for the Red Cross and did death notifications in Okinawa. I volunteered for the Red Cross at the hospital and, where we were stationed, but that was it. I mean, I wasn't even a registered voter, Michael. I didn't know the difference between a Democrat or a Republican. I didn't.
All right. So what becomes your first step, Candy?
Well, so my first step actually was to put this notice in the paper to see if I could get, people over to my home and kind of start learning about it. And you all have to remember, this is in the days before the internet and social media and Wi-Fi and all of that. So when you did research, it was entirely different than it is now. So I had a meeting. I had one person show up from Los Angeles, bless her heart. She had been injured in a drunk driving crash, and she had tried to create some change that wasn't very successful. And then she gave me some names of people that we would want to meet with, and like the Attorney General. I will tell you, when my girlfriend said to me, I think we need to meet with the Attorney General, and I found out who it was. I said, does he have 2 stars or 4 stars? I mean, this is how incredibly naive I was.
Naive, right.
Very. So then a friend of mine, actually, who, I was telling all my friends I was going to do this. And she said, oh, I know a lawyer. And I think you need to see a lawyer. So we went to see the lawyer, who eventually became a judge. And I sat with him. I was with my sister and a girlfriend. And I sat with him and told him what I wanted to do. And I remember him looking at us and saying to me, I will do this for you for free. Set me up with, MAD and the nonprofit, because I believe in what you're doing. And he said, but I'm also going to tell you, you're going to be very successful. And I mean, I didn't know what success even meant in those days. I mean, I was a real estate agent at this time and successful, but there's a world of difference. Although I used to tell the media I went from selling homes to selling MAD. But, and I said, why do you say that? And he said, because it's a sexy issue. And I remember being so offended by that remark.
How dare he?
I know, although later I learned he was right, and it was. So he set us up, and then I just started researching. I met with, the Attorney General and various other people, and state this in California, the California Highway Patrol, and I always emphasize this. I don't think I could have done MAD without them, because their lobbyist at the time, Spike Helmick, was so invaluable to me. They taught me how to read the vehicle code. They taught me about the laws. They gave me the book and a tape recorder, and I would meet with them once a week, and I would have all these questions for them on what's felony this and, misdemeanor that. I learned the law better than district attorneys did, and I say that with no humility whatsoever. And they took me, as they lobbied, they took me into C sessions of people speaking before the legislature. And God, talk about eye-opening. And, and they would be testifying and I'd be sitting in the back so I could learn how this worked. And then I had a really good friend, Michael, and I don't know if you remember him at all back in the day, but his name was B.T. Collins.
Yep.
B.T. was was a quadriplegic when you're without an arm and a leg, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact term, and I had met him at a bar stool in Bangkok, Thailand. BT and I have a backstory. But anyway, Governor Brown, as you may remember, at that time decided that he would like to bring on a Republican to work with him at the Capitol as his legislative liaison. And he chose BT. So BT notified me when he was coming to Sacramento. I sold him his homes. He knew my children. He used to swim in my pool. And I remember asking him one time how he managed, and he said, I swim in circles. Anyway, he was the funniest guy. He, of course, when I wanted to do this, said, come see me. And I did. And he said, well, you need to have somebody carry a bill. And I said, what's that? And he explained it to me. And I said, okay, who do I have do this? He said, who is your representative? And I said, I don't know what a representative is. Right. And he said, well, are you a Republican or a Democrat? And I said, I don't know. I don't know what that is. He got really angry and he said, get out of my office. He put his hand out, goes, get out of my office and go register to vote and don't come back until you have. Well, I left his office and I didn't know where to go to register to vote. So I asked his secretary, I said, where do I go to register to vote? And she said, oh, you go to DMV. So I went over to DMV and, they gave me the form and I chose to be an other, of which I'm thankful that I did. And I became an other, but I was then registered to vote. And then I went back to see him and he said, oh, and that turns out that my representative at that time was a Democrat and she was a nurse and the mother of twins. And he said, she is the one who should carry this bill. And I went to her and she said, absolutely. And we didn't really have much of a movement at that time. So I then decided to have a press conference and announcing MAD. And my first strategy was to deal with this problem at a local, state, and national level. At the state level, we decided to call on Governor Brown to solve the problem. I hate the word study and I hate the word awareness, to solve the problem of drunk driving with a task force. So we initiated a petition drive we held our first press conference. Actually, it was my first press conference, but whatever, at the state capitol. And my daughter, who was killed, was a twin. Her twin sister started SADD, SADD, which at that time was Students Against Drunk Drivers. And she and her friends made up picket signs and they marched around the Capitol. And at the same time, we were doing the press conference. And then we had people sitting outside with a petition asking people to sign. And that was in August 1980. I don't remember the exact date. But that's really how MAD started. And what happened, unfortunately, just before that, which unfortunately helped us, was that there was a horrible crash in Northern California by a multiple repeat offender drunk driver who wiped out 9 members of a family. And it was the worst crash, drunk driving in Northern California at that time. So the press had already seen this tragedy. And then, of course, there was mine. So, and I actually worked with that family, and they became one of my first chapters. But, and that's how we started. I mean, it was just.
Now, one of the moments in which literally the movement changed was your press conference in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm. I had since then relocated to Texas.
Right.
And while there, I was contacted by a California legislator who was introducing a bill to color code driver's licenses so that those over 21 had a certain color and those under 21 didn't have a color or whatever, and wanted my support. And I said, absolutely. So we flew there, and we got there at 1 or 2 in the morning. And I was staying with a friend of mine. My daughter and I were staying with a friend of mine. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, this is going to be so boring. So we go to a press conference and we hold up a driver's license and we say, oh, color code. I really thought that would just not get press at all. And I was trying to think of ways to get press. And I went, whoa, what if a teenager could use their regular driver's license, but have it faked, which kids were doing in those days, just have the age changed and be able to buy alcohol. And we all thought that was brilliant, but then we couldn't figure out what teenager we could get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to agree to do this. And my daughter said, well, I'll do it, Mom. And we said, okay, cool. I called California Highway Patrol at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, this is Candace, and, told them what we wanted to do. They said, come in. So at 6 o'clock in the morning, we went in. They altered her driver's license to show that she was actually 21, which at that time was the law in California. And then they, with their undercover team, took her out before the press conference to buy alcohol in the various liquor stores. Yep. And so, and she did, and she was able to in most of them, not one, no, but the rest of them, I think they went to 4. She was able to buy booze. So when she came back, we stacked the beer cans up on the podium. Yes. And she spoke behind one and I spoke behind the other. And it generated national news.
Right. And from there, the movement got larger and larger and larger, and you became a national figure.
Actually, it happened before that, to be honest with you, because the movie came out in 1983. And at that time, we were really, I was already doing national shows. We had changed the laws in California, which made national press, including the Johnny Carson show, who went on his show on January 1st of 1984 and said to everybody, let me tell you about a new law, and told them about drunk driving. And he was very serious about it. And I applauded him on TV and all the guest shows I was doing for doing that, told everybody they would go to jail. And then, as you know, later he was arrested for drunk driving and hauled a cop out on the stage with him and made a joke of it. And then I went after him. Senator Orrin Hatch and I went after him on all the major shows. But we had already gotten fairly big before the movie aired. But I think it was the movie that really did it.
It was the movie. Okay. So, Candy, here's what I want to talk to you about in
Mm.
conclusion. What you learned about being an ordinary American, not registered to vote. How can people learn from your story about their own power to affect change, to see things that are unjust? What are the lessons that you would instill to others about their own power, even though they don't recognize that they have it?
Well, I do consulting with a lot of startups, and the first thing I tell them is if you need to be willing to make this a priority in your life, and not everybody is willing to do that. So, I'm just very clear with them. This is not a part-time job. I gave up real estate in order to do this full-time and went without a salary for 2 years and was eligible for welfare again. But I tell them, I said, if you really want to do this, first you have a passion. You have to have a passion. And it has to be a priority in your life. And if
Would
it's
you be
not,
willing to go for, Candy, would you be willing to go further? I don't want to put words in your mouth, and you're a very independent woman.
Mhm.
Would you be willing to say more than a passion, almost an obsession?
Well, it's interesting because Ralph Nader and I, and I'm sorry, I forgot the minister's name, Jerry Falwell, I think it was, did Good Morning America show. And in which somebody had criticized us for being obsessive, all three of us, for being obsessive about our causes.
Right.
And I remember Ralph Nader saying, well, you don't criticize Lee Iacocca. Would you criticize him? And he mentioned several other people like Steve Jobs. He said, would you criticize him? And he said, we're no different. We're entrepreneurs with a cause. And that always stayed with me, actually. And I do emphasize that people who want to do this need to be entrepreneurial because you need to come up with creative. I mean, all the creation in Matt, at least while I was there, was really basically came from yours truly.
And done with a very low, almost no budget. Is that fair? I mean, you weren't being bankrolled by anybody.
No, for the first 2 years, I didn't get paid. So you're talking about basically zero budget. We didn't start making money until we started direct mail, which is a whole other story. But anyway, and I also tell them that, and I've learned this over the years, not just from my cause, but from others as well. If it's a situation in which, for example, and still do, but back then I would get calls from, unfortunately, women whose children had been sexually abused. And that was not a great topic. If people were afraid to talk about it. And
Right.
I would work with them and say, unfortunately, if you can't get people to talk about it, then you're going to have a hard time getting people to follow you. And you need people to follow you because you don't have a lobby groups. This is grassroots we're talking about. And it will be harder to create change. So I think people, if they're interested in doing this, but I'll tell you something in today's world that's entirely different. But, if you're interested in doing something, the first thing you need to do is feel sure that this is something you're passionate about, that you're willing to make as a priority in your life, that you're willing to surround yourself with the right people and the best people. I didn't necessarily. Um, and make sure you have good guidance, and make sure you research the issue. I tell them that constantly. Go back and research, which I did. Learn the law, learn what's happening, learn what's not happening, learn why, learn this, learn that. Don't start a movement without knowing all of those things, or you won't succeed.
Got it. Candy, what is your life like now? What are you doing? How are you devoting your time and energy? And how can people learn more about what you're doing?
Mm-hmm. So some years ago, when I was doing consulting for a company that had an oral fluid device which tests for drugs, and hired me to work with them, and I became really fascinated by this, and I still am, because the police could use it at the time of arrest if somebody was suspected of driving drugged, which, thanks to the legalization of marijuana, has become far more popular, has increased dramatically. And so this device, if used at the time of arrest, can at least keep the driver from going back on the road. It can show through oral saliva that there are drugs in the system and get them off the road, which to me was critical. And so in doing that, I was going out, to all the safety conferences and everything. And I was amazed at how many people that were still with NHTSA or not with NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, would corner me and say, hey, have you ever thought of coming back and starting another nonprofit? And I hadn't actually, and said no. And they said, well, would you seriously consider it? Because everybody was unhappy with that. And I did. And I saw that nobody was doing anything on drugged driving, no one. And I also saw that no one at that time was doing anything on distracted driving, which was just becoming known. So I decided that I would start a nonprofit, We Save Lives, that would focus on the 3Ds, drunk, drugged, and distracted driving, and would be a coalition of organizations rather than just one organization working on its own. And we have about 60 partners now, or 70. And we would take on all three issues. And we were the first organization to tackle drug driving. We did the first PSA in this country on drug driving. And so that's what we do. We focus on drug.
And how can audiences all over the world learn more about your current work? Where would they go to?
WeSaveLives.org. And they could also go to my website, CandaceLightner.org or .com, but WeSaveLives.org, which is actually being redone. But anyway, WeSaveLives.org is the website, and that's where you can sign up and get a newsletter or whatever and learn more about what we're doing. And right now, for all you teenagers and parents of teenagers, this is the deadliest time of year for teen drivers and teen passengers. It's normally called from May 30th to after Labor Day. It's normally called the 100 deadliest days of summer. And we have formed a group that now call it the 100 safest days of summer. And through social media and other means and media interviews, etc., are educating both parents and teens on how to stay safe during this time of year. And the other thing, the one that I'm most proud of, is one that was my campaign that I launched several years ago called National Passenger Safety Week, because we focus on drivers and not on passengers. And about 30% of the crashes of drunk, drug, distracted driving involve passengers. And I sit there and I think, why didn't they say something? Why did they get in the car? Why didn't they stop the driver from driving drunk, drugged, or distracted? And so I came up with this idea of National Passenger Safety Week. And I was fortunate enough to be able to partner with a great group, the National Road Safety Foundation. We launched it. It's now on the NHTSA calendar. It is now a big thing. Other countries have now started doing the same thing. That one I'm really passionate about and just really proud of. And these are just some of the things that we've done.
And Candy, I just want to close with this. I've told you this privately. I continue to live in the Southern California area.
Mm-hmm.
And when I drive around, I stop at stoplights, just like everybody else. And I turn my head to the right, and I will very, very, very frequently see people, often young people, but not only young people, often women, but not only women, looking down and texting while they're at the stoplight. And what I see, or what I feel I see, is almost an addictive relationship with their phone. They cannot sit still. They must check that phone while they're driving. It is very, very disturbing. And so I applaud you for taking on this issue, and thank you. Thank you for your vulnerability, authenticity, transparency today. You changed the world. Do you have any estimation of how many
Of how many lives?
lives, how many
600.
lives have been saved?
Yeah, over
How many?
600. 600,000.
Ladies and gentlemen, 600,000.
Mm-hmm.
More than 500,000 people are alive today because a woman said, no more.
Mm.
And Candy, you were that woman. And I'm so, so pleased that you shared your story with our audience today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Well, friends, that was one of the more memorable editions of Without Notes in the 11 years we've been doing this. Candy Lightner, a woman who changed the world with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I hope you found it half as fascinating as I did and impactful. How does a woman with no experience literally change the world? With no budget, no experience. Well, her story is one that I think will live on for quite some time. Friends, if you find the concept of these conversations, authentic, vulnerable, transparent conversations of value, you can help us by liking the episode, sharing the episode, commenting on the episode, and of course, subscribing. These are things that you can do not only to support our show, which of course you will do, but also the whole concept of these kinds of conversations, which frankly I think are most needed in this new and sometimes troubling world. I'm Michael Levine, and we'll look forward to seeing you on another edition of Without Notes.